Standard biology final review. Your dates of your final are going to be on 6/5, that's Tuesday for A Day, and 6/6, that's Wednesday for B Day. You can access this review online at www.srhsbio.wikispaces.com. First section is DNA and protein synthesis. So the first question asks us to label this DNA molecule with the phosphate, the sugar, the nucleotide, and to complete the complementary strand. So the little circles, that's going to be what holds together my DNA strand. That is going to be my phosphate. The little pentagons, those are sugars. They say that DNA is made up of a sugar-phosphate backbone, so we can see that the sugar-phosphate alternates, forming the backbones of the DNA ladder. And a nucleotide is going to be a subunit. It's this whole thing here that includes the phosphate, the sugar, and the base. So in DNA, A is going to pair with T, G is going to pair with C. So we can go ahead and fill those in. Next question, what process involves cutting open DNA molecule and inserting new section? So that's going to be gene splicing. So a section of DNA is removed. So here I have a section of DNA that gets cut out, and I'll do this using enzymes, and I'm going to insert that into a new strand of DNA. Where does protein synthesis take place? So that takes place at the ribosome. So in protein synthesis, the DNA code is stored inside the nucleus. mRNA makes a working copy, a one-sided working copy. That comes out where it gets read by the ribosome, and the ribosome puts these together and strings together the amino acids to make a protein. For the following DNA strand, write down the mRNA strand and the amino acid code it produces. So first you're going to need one of these charts here, and you're going to need to remember that there's no T in mRNA. Instead, A pairs with U. So for the mRNA code, TAC becomes AUG, so on and so forth. Just replacing the G's with C's, T becomes A and A becomes U, all the way to the end. Now I'm going to use my wheel. So I have A, U, G, that's methionine. CUU is leucine. So is UUA, so on and so forth, until we get to the end with UGA, which is the stop codon. Tells me to stop coding my protein. Next section is reproduction, mitosis, and meiosis. So the purpose of mitosis is to replace body cells in case of injury, so if they get lost, also to help an organism grow. The purpose of meiosis is to make cells for sexual reproduction. Mitosis makes somatic, aka body cells, whereas meiosis makes sex cells, gametes, for example, eggs and sperm. In mitosis, all cells are going to be completely identical. They have the same genetic code. They're clones of the parent cell. There's no genetic diversity, and evolution cannot occur. In the case of meiosis, each cell is unique. This is due to the random pairing of chromosomes and crossing over. This is good for sexual reproduction, and we get lots of diversity, which means evolution can occur. Mitosis is asexual, which means one parent. The offspring is a clone of the parent, whereas sexual means two parents. Each contributes half of the genetic code, half from mother, half from father. What are the benefits to mitosis? It's fast, and the parent has to make very little investment. The benefit of mitosis is that each offspring is genetically unique. Does crossing over occur? No, not in mitosis, but it does occur in meiosis. What are types of asexual reproduction? Which one is used by bacteria, and how does it benefit the bacteria? So there's budding, which we see in hydras, where the offspring grows off of the parent. There's also vegetative. So that's where a shoot can grow off, usually of a plant. That's why it's vegetative, vegetables. A shoot can grow off, and then offspring can grow from that shoot. And binary fission. So in a bacteria cell, they duplicate the DNA and then split into two pieces. This is essentially mitosis. So bacteria have binary fission. This is fast. They can make offspring very quickly. There's little investment of energy by the parent bacteria. And they've developed a way to swap spit, which means they can trade sections of DNA and they can still obtain genetic diversity. A mutation occurs in a liver cell and a gamete cell, which is passed on to offspring. So only gametes are passed on to offspring. Whenever you were made from a gamete from your mother and from your father. So therefore, only mutations in the gametes can be passed along. Example, a man has liver cancer due to a random mutation in his liver cells. That doesn't mean that all of his children are also going to have liver cancer. So we found a protein, and it slows down duplication of DNA, and I want to know how that affects mitosis. So duplicating DNA is a critical step in mitosis, or making new cells. If I can't duplicate my DNA, or that process is slowed down, then the process of mitosis will also be slowed down or stopped. Next section is about genetics, pedigrees, and genetic engineering. So if I have two tall pea plants that are made together, they produce both tall and short plants. So I need to make a Punnett square explaining this. So the only way that a parent plant that is tall can produce a short plant is if the short gene is somewhere hidden in its genotype. So the way that the plants can appear tall but have a hidden short gene is if the short gene is recessive. So I'm going to go ahead and define capital T as tall and lowercase t as short. So the only way it's possible for me to get tall and short plants is if the parents are heterozygous for height. So I got tall homozygous, two tall heterozygous, and one short homozygous plant. A tall pea plant is mated with another tall pea plant. All of the offspring were tall. So, in order to make every single offspring tall, one of the parents has to be homozygous dominant. You inherit one allele from each parent. So as long as one of the parents is homozygous dominant, it doesn't matter what the other parent is, because every single offspring is going to inherit one of these tall genes from the homozygous tall parent. So I could have another plant that is homozygous tall, or I could have a plant that is heterozygous tall, or I could have a plant that is homozygous short. No matter what, all of my offspring will be tall. The gene for widow's peak is dominant. A man is homozygous dominant for widow's peak, and a woman is heterozygous for the trait. So homozygous means the same. Homozygous dominant means two dominant genes. And heterozygous means different. So I'm going to go ahead and define capital W as widow's peak, And I'm going to define lowercase w. I'm going to make that funny tail so we know it's lowercase, as no widow's peak. So that is big W because he's homozygous dominant. Right away we know that all of his children are going to have widow's peak. Just like with the pea plants, one of the parents is homozygous dominant, so the only gene that that parent can pass on is the dominant gene. So in this case, that's widow's peak. For the woman, she's heterozygous, which means different, so she's got a capital W and a lowercase w. So all of the children will have widow's peak 100%. 50% of them are homozygous dominant and 50% of them are heterozygous. Two pea plants are mated together. Purple flowers are dominant over white flowers. They produce 52 plants with purple flowers and 49 plants with white flowers. So I'm trying to figure out, based on this information, what genotypes my parent plants must have. So first, you have to recognize that the ratio 52 to 49 is roughly 50-50. So I got to figure out a combination which gives 50% purple and 50% white. So I'm going to define big P as purple and little p with a funny tail, so I know it's lowercase, as white. So I need something that's going to give me 50% white and 50% purple. So right away, I know that I can't be big P, big P. I know that that doesn't work because then all of my offspring would have to be purple. So that's no good. I know it can't be little w because then all of my offspring would have to be white. So I'm first going to try this. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute these. So right now I'm trying to make 50% white. So this is going to have to be little p, little p. So there's a purple plant. There's another purple plant. There's a white plant. And there's another white plant. So I get 50-50. What is a genetic mutation? So it's a change in the DNA code. This could be from a replication error during cell division. It could be from a base pair substitution. So in this picture, the first code that we have is a TAC, which becomes for the mRNA AUG. So that's MET. So this is my protein code here. In this instance, one of the T's, the second T, has been mutated to an A. So the mRNA code, instead of being ACC, is now UCC. So I have a serine instead of this amino acid here. So there's a mutation there. This really isn't a big problem. If this was in a critical place on the protein, then maybe the organism might have some difficulty or might die, but this really isn't a huge mistake. This, however, is a really big mistake. In this case, I've completely lost this second nucleotide here. So instead of coding for my normal strand, every single amino acid has been messed up. So it's not going to be a functional protein. That's bad news for the organism. Describe genetic engineering and give an example. So genetic engineering is just moving around or changing genes to produce desired traits. An example could be a tomato crop, which ripens faster on the vine, or a sheep that produces spider milk. So all I do is I take my desired gene here in yellow, and I can insert it, cut it out into a different organism, and maybe this will produce some desirable effect. In this case, this is for insect resistance. What is a clone, and how are identical twins like clones? So a clone is going to be an identical DNA copy of the parent. Identical twins have identical copies of DNA. That's why they look alike. So this picture is just to enforce the fact that I've got twins here and they have the same genetic code. This is a pedigree for feet, normal arches versus flat feet. So normal arches is dominant, capital A, and flat feet is recessive. Label each individual with possible genotypes and their phenotype. So let's first start with generation 1. Actually, we can first start with everybody who's flat-footed. So everybody who's shaded in is going to be flat-footed. So I know they're going to be little a because that's recessive. Now let's look at generation 1. They must be big A, little a. Otherwise, they couldn't have any children with flat feet. If they were big A, all of their children would have normal feet. And I see that they have one child with normal feet. I know they're not little a because they're not shaded in. And I've got 2 children with regular feet. The next generation, generation 2, can only be big A, little a, or big A from the parent generation. The ones that don't have flat feet cannot be AA, the ones that are not shaded in. So for this first individual, I'm not sure if they're big A, little a, or big A. They married somebody with flat feet, and none of their children have flat feet. So I would lean towards big A, but it's possible that they just haven't. This person is big A, little a, but he just hasn't had any offspring that have flat feet because he's only had 2. Individual 3 could be big A, little a, or big A. I really can't make any prediction there other than that I know he has to be regular footed, so he could be big A, little a, or big A. Individual 4, however, I know has to be big A, little a. If they were big A, they couldn't have any flat-footed children, and they've got 2 here. So let's fill in the last generation. They have to be all big A, little a, because they inherit one allele from each parent. And we can see here that in this case, both of the women that married these 2 men over here, they're flat-footed. So at least one of their alleles for their children are going to be little a. Because they're not flat-footed, I know the other one has to be big A. Now, this person over here, generation 7 and generation 3, individual 7, they're going to be big A, little a. I know that because they're not shaded in, so they're not little a. And they have children who are flat-footed, so they can't be big A. Next section is on evolution, adaptation, and variation. Give an example of an adaptation. How can adaptations change a population over time? So an example of that could be pesticide-resistant insects. So I have a population of insects, and the red ones are pesticide resistant. So an insecticide is applied, so all of the non-resistant bugs are going to die. Resistant bugs are all that is left, so they're going to reproduce until competition limits their numbers. So now my population has changed. They're all pesticide resistant. So this would be a very quick change, a very quick adaptation, simply because all the other ones died off. But this process could also take a really long time as well. What is natural selection? Give an example. So some genetic variations can result in favorable traits. If you have a favorable trait, that means you're going to live longer. And if you live longer, you're going to reproduce more offspring. The survival rate and reproduction rate are due to nature selecting for the most favorable genes based on the conditions of the environment. So an example of this could be the peppered moth. The color of the moth depends on how well it blends in. So the ones that blend in well are going to live longer and reproduce more, as opposed to the ones that stick out, which will get eaten by predators. How does natural selection influence the frequency of an adaptation in a population? If an adaptation is favorable, any organism that has that adaptation will reproduce more. Thus, that adaptation is more common in the population. Other organisms without the adaptation may die sooner, causing them to reproduce less, so that adaptation is going to disappear. Why is variation so important for survival of the species? So if the environment suddenly changes and a particular species is poorly adapted to that sudden change, that species will die off. So having that variation allows some of the organisms to survive in a species should the environment suddenly change. So an example of that is the peppered moths. Light moths were once more common than dark moths because the trees were light, so the moths that were light blended in better. During the Industrial Revolution, the environment suddenly changed and the trees became covered with soot. So, dark moths became favored by the change in the environment. So the species overall changed. If they were all light moths, then the species would have died off. What key factors influence how quickly natural selection occurs? One, sexual reproduction is going to give me the most genetic variation. So I'm going to have the highest number of different adaptations and different genes. Also, a quickly changing environment will force species to change, to survive, or die off. Define evolution and give an example. What is something that supports evolution? So evolution is a process of change in a population over time. An example would be life beginning as single cells, which develop to more complex structures over time. A piece of evidence, there's several. There's the fossil record, which can show me the anatomical structures of organisms over time. DNA and protein similarities, the more that a species shares, the more closely related they will be. And there's embryological evidence as well. If you look at the embryos of different animals, they look very similar during development. The more closely related those species are, the longer the embryos will look alike. Next section is classification and kinship. So according to the data below, which deer species is the most closely related? So I need to see how many bands each species has in common. The more bands, the more closely related those species will be to the common ancestor. So for species 2, I can count that I've got 1, 2 bands in common. For species 3, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bands in common. And for species 4, I only have 3 bands in common. So that means that species 3 is the most closely related to the common ancestor. Which 2 species are most closely related and least closely related? So the least closely related are going to be the human and the frog. If you look, they have 67 different amino acids for the hemoglobin protein. So because they have the most differences, they're the least closely related. The most closely related is going to be the gorilla and the human because they only have 1 amino acid that's different. So out of the 146 amino acids, the human and the gorilla have 145 that are the same. The diagram is used to show evolutionary relationships. How are the branches related to the trunk? So the branches, all these organisms up here, all have the same common ancestor down here at the trunk. As these different species evolved, they may change to give rise to new species and new organisms, new branches, or they may die off. So each branch, each intersection, there's some key difference between that organism and the ones that came before it. How can the table be used to determine the relatedness of the species? So according to this, we would say the most closely related are the alligator and the human because they have the most characteristics in common. I can organize this into a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree, like in the previous slide. A bacteria is found that has a cell membrane and makes its own food without using sunlight. So which species below is most closely related to the new species? Well, it's going to be bacteria C because it has the most in common with the new species, so it is likely related. However, word of caution, this could be due to similar adaptations to similar environments. So, for example, most bacteria have cell membranes, so I would probably need some other information, some genetic information, something like that to completely conclude how closely related they are. Next section is ecology. So, give an example of abiotic and biotic. Abiotic could be sunlight, and the biotic could be plants photosynthesizing with that sunlight. Complete the table. So for mutualism, they mutually benefit. Both organisms benefit. An example of that would be a clownfish living on an anemone. The clownfish pushes food towards the anemone, which is a filter feeder, and the anemone provides a home for the clownfish. Commensalism, that means that one benefits and the other one has no effect. They don't experience any benefit or any harm. So that would be like barnacles living on a whale. The barnacles don't do anything for the whale, but by living on the whale, the barnacles have a place to live, and because the whale is moving, lots of food moves past the barnacles because they're filter feeders. Parasitism is where one organism will benefit and the other one will be harmed. So that would be like a tick feeding on a dog. For this, we have a forest food web, and we want to label them. So the producer here is going to be the red oak. Herbivores are going to be things that eat only the tree, only the producer. Carnivores are going to be anything that eats another organism, another animal. So all of these guys are carnivores. And the deer mouse, we see that it eats both the calypter and the producer, so that's going to be an omnivore. The reason all of these are underlined is because these are all consumers. The producer is not underlined. There is a sudden increase in deer population. What does this mean for the deer tick? So, more deer, which would mean more food for the deer ticks, means more deer ticks. The other animals that the tick feeds on may also increase because now the tick is feeding on many more deer as opposed to the red squirrel and the deer mouse. So those populations might increase. What type of relationship exists between the red oak and the deer mouse? So the red oak is a producer and the red squirrel is the consumer. So this is a producer-consumer relationship. What about the blue jay and the ant? So the blue jay feeds on the ant, which is another animal. So this is a predator-prey relationship. What essential organisms are missing from the food web? So in order for this food web to be complete, I have to have some way for these organisms, whenever they die, to be decomposed and return the nutrients into the soil. In turn, the producers use those nutrients from that decaying matter to grow. So now we got to use the forest food web to fill in the energy pyramid. So at the bottom, we're going to have the red oak, which is our producer. On top of that is everything that eats the red oak. On top of that is everything that eats the level below it. So the deer mouse appears twice because it feeds on the red oak as well as the caterpillar. And the top is going to be the blue jay and the tick. So an example of a food chain here is just something that connects one organism from each level. Would be red oak to the caterpillar and the ant and the blue jay. Which level contains the greatest amount of energy? So according to the 10% rule, each level can only get 10% of the energy from the level below it. Therefore, the bottom has the most energy, which comes from the sun. What role do decomposers play in the ecosystem? They feed on or break down dead organisms, which recycles matter in the environment. So whenever they consume or eat dead plants and animals, they turn into simpler forms of matter which can be used by the producers to complete the food chain. Examples of these are fungi and bacteria. Why does the base have to be so much wider than the top? So again, the 10% rule says that each level can only get 10% of the energy from the level below it. Energy is lost at each level to the environment, so less mass is supported at each level. There must be enough energy at the bottom to support the higher levels. So we always have producers as the most mass. So here we see we got 1,000 kilograms, 110. It goes up as we increase. So they'll be the most producers. Bacteria recycle nitrogen to the environment. Why is this so important and where is it stored? So by cycling this matter, the producers can use it to grow, which sustains the food chain. Decomposers, such as bacteria, store nitrogen in the soil. So part of the nitrogen cycle here, dead organisms can be decomposed to leave the nutrients in the soil. So what is succession? So an example could be a glacier recedes, leaving behind exposed rocks. So down here we've got exposed rocks. Over time, different organisms will start to move in. Eventually they'll have some small grasses here. As they grow and die, they're going to change the ecosystem and prepare it for these bigger species to start to move in. And over time, the organisms settle in and die off as they change the environment. What three things are recycled through the ecosystem? So there's water by the water cycle, nitrogen by the nitrogen cycle, and we also have the carbon cycle.